Hello, Black New Mexico. My name is Nicole Bedford, Deputy Director of the Office of African American Affairs, and I bring you greetings. 14 days of peaceful protests, and it is still going on, not only in the United States, but across the world. The protest is not just around the killing of George Floyd, but for the ongoing problem of unequal justice and inequity across the board when it comes to Blacks. Here in New Mexico, we have a chance to make changes not only in law enforcement, but with elected officials and the inequities our race faces every day. Now is the time to stop being divided and work together towards injustice, inequity, and unfair treatment of Black people. If we stand together and fight together, change can be made. Before I introduce our wonderful guest speaker, I have a couple of announcements to make. Our new website is up and running. You can find announcements, upcoming events, and tell us how we are doing in our office. Go check out our new website at oaaa.state.nm.us and tell us how you like it. Also, don't forget to do your 2020 census. It is very important to take the census. This is how we bring money not only to our state, but to our communities as well. Fill out the 2020 census. It is very important. And before we bring on our guest speaker, I would like to introduce Sonia Smith with the Department of Health. She has been working very hard in getting the African American tested through COVID-19. Sonia Smith, if you can come on.
Hey, good morning. Thank you, Nicole. I appreciate being here and being a part of this wonderful team. I'm enjoying working very closely with your office, and not only we're having fun, we're doing the work that needs to be done. So here are some quick updates as of June 8th, 2020. We have tested more than 230,000 people across the state. We have almost 9,000 people who are positive. Unfortunately, we have 396 people who have succumbed to this. So we do pray for their families and their loved ones. But the good news is we have over 3,000 people who have recovered from this. So we do know that recovery is out there, and we have 192 people who are currently positive in the Black community. So we have coming up this weekend, this Saturday, we'll be in Clovis testing, and then we will be at UNM on the 27th testing. And I want to say thank you to New Covenant Worship Center here in Rio Rancho for allowing us to come out this past Saturday to test, and to their head, Pastor McCall. So that's all the update that I have, but you can always go on to the DOH website to get more information. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Sonia. And again, it is very important to go out and get tested. This is how we can, to stop the pandemic. If we find out, if we go out and get the testing. So again, we'll have a testing in Clovis, and then this weekend, and then next on the 27th, we'll have a big testing over at UNM. And you can find the information not only on the Department of Health, but also on our website. Now to our guest speaker. Jim Harvey is not only just our guest speaker, he's also one of our facilitators for our podcast. Jim Harvey, he will be talking about interpersonal violence now, a very important topic, especially now, not only with the pandemic, but also what's going on with the protests. Jim Harvey is an organizational development professional specializing in services to nonprofit organizations. Jim arrived in New Mexico to serve as state director of volunteer services for the Red Cross, and served in that role until the state was merged with another state. During his tenure in that position, he grew the volunteer enrollment from 300 to nearly 1,000. He is a former public health professional with more than 35 years of service to federal, state, and local health departments, as well as community-based providers delivering health and social services to underserved populations. Jim is a longtime collector and curator of African and African American art, and is a member of the Diaspora Rhythms, a Chicago-based society of collectors, artists, and educators of art from the African diaspora. Jim Harvey has served as a board member for the African American Performing Arts Center Foundation for the past 4 years and is currently serving as board president. Jim comes from a long history of community activism when he became an early member of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and later worked internationally as a dedicated anti-war advocate. He is a recipient of the DC City Council Resolution for Outstanding Leadership in Healthcare and is a certified counselor and trainer in domestic violence prevention and education. Jim has also served as a trainer in diversity and racial justice with significant focus on alternatives to violence and court diversion programs. Jim Harvey is the executive director of the Albuquerque Center for Peace and Justice. Jim Harvey lives with his spouse of 20 years and is a proud parent of 3 dogs and a cat. Welcome, Jim Harvey.
Thank you so much, Nicole. Thank you very much for that. Good morning, Black New Mexico. I'm so happy to be able to join you this morning and talk about a topic that we don't really like to talk about in the Black community, and that is interpersonal violence, or typically called domestic violence. We don't like to do that. We don't like it. It's a hard subject because it delves down into the family and family structure and interpersonal relationships, and that is exactly why we need to talk about it. So I'm going to share some things with you this morning on facing interpersonal violence during COVID-19 and during the demonstrations and uprisings that have resulted from the recent murder of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and so many others that we could talk about all day. Next slide. There are various types of interpersonal violence or domestic violence that we need to consider, and we're going to talk about domestic violence today. We're going to talk about sexual violence. We're going to talk about child abuse. We're going to talk about statistics that tie into all of these subjects, interventions, and then I'll end with sharing some resources with you. Next slide. We expect that 1 million women will severely be abused annually in the name of domestic violence. 1 million women annually. That comes down to about 1 in 4 women who will be physically assaulted or raped in their lifetime. Those are pretty staggering numbers. That's 25% of the female population in this country. That's a lot. Women that are separated are 25 times more likely to be injured than married women. These are women who go out on dates. These are women who live alone. These are women who face all kinds of isolation, and they are 25 times more likely to be injured than a married woman. 45 to 70% of battered women report abuse of their children by the fathers and the boyfriends. 3.3 million children ages 3 to 17 experience battering or worse at the hands of fathers and boyfriends. And this is not a number that should be surprising, particularly here in New Mexico, because each year we hear about devastating results of children that have lost their lives because fathers or boyfriends in particular have beaten a child to death, have sexually abused the child. So we hear about these, and it's got to stop. 60% of adolescent males incarcerated for murder. This is interesting. 60% are incarcerated for murder kill their mother's abusive male partners. Now, COVID-19 has increased these risks. Numbers have nearly doubled in New Mexico just since March. Numbers of domestic abuse, domestic violence have nearly doubled in New Mexico just since March. Now, next slide. There's an emphasis on men. We place emphasis on men for any number of reasons, and the statistics will hold this up. About 12% of adult men have been violent with an intimate female partner in the past year. Male partners commit 28% of female homicides. Female partners commit roughly 3% of male homicides. Men are stronger in most cases, and so we place this emphasis on men and the abuse that they create. Only 1 in 6 men who batter ever gets caught. About 50% get ordered into an abuser services program. About 50% complete those services. Women also engage in domestic violence, though, and we have programs that exist for women as well. Now, there are other types of abuses that I want to be sure that we don't let get by us. There's emotional abuse and psychological abuse. There's elder abuse. There's financial abuse. And as I mentioned earlier, the one that haunts us probably more than any other is child abuse. But emotional abuse, that's where we have a partner who does everything they possibly can to belittle the other partner, to make them feel less than, and then to take advantage of that in any way that they can that's going to benefit them. We have psychological abuse, again, where you do crazy making. You make people feel like, you know, what they see or what they hear, what they experience you doing to them or doing behind their backs isn't really happening. And you do it often enough so it makes them feel as if they're imagining something. Elder abuse, a serious problem. Elder abuse where we take advantage both physically and psychologically and even financially. We take grandma's check. We take auntie's social security check. If they're bedridden, if they're disabled in some way, we withhold food from them. We reduce their ability to be mobile. Those are the kinds of abuses that go on in far too many homes. And then there's financial abuse, where we just empty out bank accounts. We take money and we spend it the way we want to, and then we're ready to fight if we're challenged on it. Those are abuses. Those are abuses that amount to also a different form of violence. Sexual violence. Sexual violence is really pervasive here in New Mexico again. And unfortunately, the laws need to be strengthened in terms of the penalties that are exacted with people who are violent sexually, rape. Now, one thing that I really like to talk about when we talk about rape, that a lot of people are surprised to hear: marital rape. So your partner says, I don't feel like having sex, and you force your partner to have sex. Guess what? That's rape. No matter how it is, because no means no. Only 1 in 6 men who batter gets caught. Why? Simply because people are reluctant to report these abuses, or people are afraid to report these abuses. Next slide. Next slide, please. Characteristics of people during COVID-19. Some of the things that may contribute to domestic violence behavior in the home. Environmental constraints. You're locked in. You can't go anywhere. You've got to practice social distancing. You've got to stay safe. And cabin fever sets in and you start acting out. It's a corollary, but not a cause. Behavioral deficits. Some people suffer from psychological disabilities and they may act out. Family of origin violence. There's been domestic violence going on in the family for years, and domestic violence, I would submit to you, is a learned behavior. We learn it. We learn it from our parents. We learn it from people that are in our households. We learn it from people that have influence over us. We're taught that it's okay. Dating violence, here's a big one, and this is particularly pervasive when we're talking about teens. Dating violence is a problem. I take you out, I spend money, I show you a good time, I want you to put out. And if you don't, I get violent. No means no. Community violence, that's what we're experiencing right now. And then abusing your own children. Big problem. Next slide. Next slide, please. Characteristics of people who abuse intimate partners or other family members also include alcohol and drug abuse. Now, there's a high correlation, but it's important to remember that correlation is not cause. So if you're being abusive, you can't say it's because I drank too much or it's because of the fact that I'm abusing drugs. Those things may be correlations that could in fact lead to far more severe behavior, but those are not causes. Domestic violence is a learned behavior. Let's not lose sight of that. It's a learned behavior. Alcoholism is not a learned behavior. Drug abuse is not a learned behavior, but there is a correlation between the outcome, but it's not the cause. Substance abuse particularly alcohol and methamphetamines are likely to cause lethality. When I say lethality, it could end in death. So if you are a drug abuser or a severe abuser of alcohol, these things can end in the most violent ways. Next slide, please. These are other characteristics. Anger, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that a little bit more. Stress and anxiety, depression, generalized aggression and antisocial traits, personality disorders, frustration or fear from COVID-19. And if you take frustration and fear from COVID-19 and just back up this list, it can be a contributing factor to any of these other behaviors that I've named here. Anger, stress and anxiety, depression, generalized aggression and antisocial traits. You've lost your job, money is short. You're seeing the same people every day that you have typically relied on not being at home all day and every day, but suddenly you're there, you're locked in. The frustration and the fear that come from COVID-19 can be, again, corollaries, but not a cause. Next slide, please. When I talk about correlation versus cause, I like to offer this example. Ice cream consumption is highest during the summer. Crime tends to increase in the summer. Question for you, does eating ice cream cause crime? Next slide, please. So we want to do what we can to intervene with people who batter or abuse. We can introduce coordinated community responses or community organizations all over the city, all over the state that are there and ready to begin to provide you with intervening services to help address the core problem, and that is your propensity towards domestic violence. There are group interventions that are in play with male and female or female co-facilitation. This is really important. Group interventions, particularly with male facilitation, is critical because we want men if this is a group with men, we want men to feel comfortable and feel open about talking about the issues that may lead to them being domestic abusers. If we've got a group with females, we want females to be able to talk about in a comfortable and safe environment with other females the issues that have led them to be abusive in a relationship. And I might add that when we're talking about female abusers in a domestic situation, they usually have other intervening issues that lead them to becoming domestic abusers. They've been abused themselves, for example. They do it as a defense and get used to being defensive and using domestic abuse as a way to defend and protect themselves. Cognitive, behavioral thoughts and beliefs and feelings. This is important. Again, learned behavior. Educational interventions. We want to teach it in the schools. We need to begin to teach domestic abuse prevention in our school systems at very early ages. Science has suggested that children prior to birth can absorb domestic violence propensities because of the fact that the mother is either a victim or a perpetrator of domestic violence. Science has suggested that. So as early as we can begin to educate children away from tendencies towards domestic violence, the better off we'll be. And then we want to intervene as behaviors happen, particularly in a group. So if an individual is in a group and reports either engaging or perpetrating domestic violence or being a victim, we want to intervene in any way that we possibly can. Talk about it, break it down, explain it, and see what we can do to prevent it happening in the future. Next slide, please. How can we intervene? Let's start by holding one another accountable. Let's then address the beliefs that many have. Some of us are raised to believe that power over your partner in a relationship is a way to secure your position of authority. And the way you exercise your power is by being physically abusive. It's not the answer. Communication skills. Let's learn how to talk. Let's learn how to communicate effectively with one another. If we're in an argument, let's learn how to signal a timeout. Let's communicate our feelings without accusing one another, without making accusatory statements to one another. Let's use I words as a way to communicate our feelings. And feelings is a critical piece of what we need to learn how to do. And that is how to express your feelings genuinely. You ask someone, how do you feel? And they say, I feel good. I always say good is not a feeling word. How do you really feel? Am I frustrated? Am I tired? Am I happy? Am I sad? Do I feel lost? Do I feel alone? Communication. This ties back to beliefs: sexism, racism, classism, homophobia. The beliefs that we have about sexism, racism, classism, homophobia may translate into how we behave towards people. If we have negative attitudes about any of these isms, what we end up doing is we end up acting out on them. Now, I mentioned feelings earlier, feeling management versus anger management. Let me spend a little time on this one. We need to learn how to get in touch with our feelings. We need to learn how to express in a nonviolent but honest and secure way how we feel. So if we feel sad, let's be prepared to talk about that. Why do I feel sad? What has contributed to me feeling sad? And if it's my partner, if it's my intimate partner that has made me feel sad, I need to say, I feel sad because, and open up the door to be able to talk about it. The other side of that coin, however, is you keep your feelings bottled up and you get angry. Now, anger can be a corollary, but it's not a cause. And a lot of people that I've seen come through domestic violence programs often talk about, I just need anger management, and I always put them to a test. My test is, you're standing in the living room, you're getting ready to slap your partner or beat your partner senseless, and your grandmother walks in. What do? Most people say, well, I would stop. Well, if you would stop, that means that you know how to manage your anger. So anger management is not an issue. It's, again, getting in touch with your feelings and being able to express them in a nonviolent, open, and honest way, and be able to receive nonviolent and honest feedback. Then this empathy impact on women and children and self. This ties back to feelings as well, but put yourself in someone else's shoes. If you are an abuser, just ask yourself, how am I making that person feel that I'm abusing? If you're being abusive to a child, how is that child feeling? And what kind of damage am I doing physically and psychologically to that child? And finally, what does that really make me look like and feel like in the long run? Again, getting in touch with who you are. Impact on others. Issues and referrals. Impact on others. What is the impact that my behavior is having on others? What are the issues that have me acting out? And how can I then refer myself or my partner or a family member to someone who can be helpful, someone who can help me address and break down all those issues that I need to address. Next slide, please. Now, I talked about anger management. When anyone talks about anger management as being the cause of their behavior, let's put them to the test. Let's see if they pass that anger management quiz. You know, I call it the grandmother test. If they pass the grandmother test, then anger management is not a problem. Pastoral counseling. Some people believe that pastoral counseling can be effective. I'm not very big on it because in most situations, pastoral counseling is going to lead to, at all costs, keeping couples together, and that may not be what needs to happen. Individual therapy. Individual therapy may or may not be effective, but this is one that I would suggest, we lean towards as opposed to leaning away from, as a way that we can address domestic violence. However, I find that group settings, peer settings, are the most effective way to address domestic violence and get people to respond to one another, exchange their ideas and their experiences, challenge one another on feelings, challenge one another on beliefs and behaviors. And then there's couples therapy. Couples therapy for me is really a problem. Why is it a problem? You're not going to get, in most instances, you're just not going to get both parties to open up and be completely honest about what's happening and how they feel. And if you do, it opens the door for what can happen after that session is over. So I tend to shy away from couples therapy, and I'm not a big supporter of it. In personal confrontation, just get up in your face and say, you did this and you did that. Again, we're accusing people. We're challenging them in the most confrontational way. What happens? The perpetrator shuts down. They don't hear anything. They get defensive. They might even get violent with you. So these are contraindicated approaches in my book. And these are the ones that I tend to stay away from. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. What can be done? See something, say something. What do I mean by that? I just said personal confrontation, no. But if there's a way that you can comfortably, safely, and non-violently have a conversation with someone who is perpetrating domestic violence, have a conversation with them. If you know someone who is a victim of domestic violence, have a conversation with them. Let them know what their options are. Legal interventions. Now, like I said, very few people end up in the court system for supervised counseling, but it is a solution. And usually programs require perpetrators to enroll in a program that could run anywhere from 26 weeks to a year, where they may go to weekly sessions for that length of time and participate effectively and hopefully begin to turn things around with good intervention. Only 7 randomized studies to date would provide us with any information that would hone in on how effective these kinds of interventions are. But we're constantly trying to do more studying, trying to examine how effective we are, trying to determine how many people go through a program and come out the other side a lot better than they were. I had an incident where I had a hardened gangbanger who came into one of my programs, and on day 1, he sat there and he folded his arms and he said, "You can say all you want to say, but I'm just here to complete this program and then I'm gone." And the remarkable thing was that by the time we hit the 12th week of that program, he was an advocate. His attitude had changed, and he's a better man today as a result of being in the 26-week program. These programs do work. Don't be afraid to discuss it. Discuss these things in our families. Like I said at the top, one of the things that we suffer from is we're afraid to discuss it. We have relatives that we know are victims of domestic violence. We have relatives that we know are perpetrators of domestic violence. And we say, well, that's not my problem. Well, it is your problem. It's all our problem. So we have to get past our fear about discussing it. And then for the sake of perpetrators and victims alike, don't be reluctant to report it. Call the authorities. You might save someone's life. Call the authorities. You might force someone into a legal intervention program that could help change their life by attacking and breaking down their beliefs, their behaviors, their attitudes. And finally, if you're a victim, seek out help. We've estimated that somewhere around 7 incidents of domestic violence have to impact an individual before he or she decides to seek out help and leave that abusive situation. 7. Could it be the 5th time that you lose your life? Could it be the 4th time that you lose your life? Could it be the 6th time that you lose your life? Could it be that seventh that you're irreparably harmed because you did not leave when you should? And there are plenty of resources out here that you can go to that will help rescue you from an abusive situation. Next slide, please. So here are some resources. The Domestic Violence Resource Center here in Albuquerque, and the phone number is up for you. And statewide, the New Mexico Coalition Against Domestic Violence, and the phone number and hotlines for both of these agencies are up for you. And then there's a teen dating abuse hotline as well. Please use these resources. Finally, let me just leave you with a thought. James Baldwin once said, to be Black and live in America is to live in a constant state of rage. And God knows we have plenty of reasons to be in a constant state of rage. The one place that rage does not belong is in your intimate relationships, in your homes, with your families. Thank you so much.
Well, Jim, thank you very much. I think you've presented a concise overview of what many people don't understand, which is the public health approach and how we look at things through an ecological framework, and how that works in terms of how we understand the epidemic of domestic violence, interpersonal violence, and what that means, particularly under these challenging situations. I think your quote from Baldwin was very apropos about this issue of being Black in America means that you live in a constant state of rage. As we think about this notion of being in a constant state of rage, we have to think about exactly what's happening today in many ways with the anti-racism, with the anti-racism issues that need to be developed, and the racialized issues of institutionalized racism. So I think my question really, for you as we think about interpersonal violence, do you think and feel that interpersonal violence is a reaction and response to structural violence? As we talk about structural violence and community violence in that sense, we have to think about how larger groups have used their power to enforce control over people, over society, politics, economics, and violence. And those reactions to those are usually what leads to those frustrations and things. So can the public health approach that you've talked about be used to solve institutionalized racism that's causing so much of the despair and rage? I mean, what is really the problem? What are the causes? What works and for whom? And how do we implement or scale up effective policy and programs? And you covered some of that, but I kind of feel that, yes, domestic violence reacting to the harm and the danger that's in this structural violence that's created against us by being in this country and being devoid of our place in history and our knowledge of our past and historical culture. So that's kind of a long commentary, but I think that we have to start thinking about looking upstream, but what's causing this stuff in the first place, and stop blaming victims, as you said before.
I'm glad you mentioned that, Dr. Martin, because right now we're beginning to hear in some quarters around the country some serious discussions about declaring racism, for example, as a public health emergency. And that is a big feeder into the whole notion of structural violence, because then we talk about institutional racism and the negative impacts that it has had historically on Black people. You know, we've learned, and when I talk about learned behaviors, we learn these negative behaviors as a defense mechanism and also as a response to much of what's been happening to us historically. And it gets passed on from one generation to the next. So yes, structural violence is a major contributor to this. This is where we learned it. This is how it becomes ingrained in our lives, and this is where we have to begin to attack it. So as we take on institutional racism as just the front line of the attack of changing culture, you know, we'll begin to set ourselves up for beginning to address the other impacts of structural violence as they trickle down to us individually.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Any other comments, or anyone else have comments or questions, things they'd like to say? It's a good comment from Dr. Lisa Taylor there on the chat.
Let's see, Dr. Taylor says, given the police state we have to address the reality that some do not want to expose their abuser to the system for fear of what will happen to the abuser. Good point, Lisa, and thank you so much for that. That's what I think I said earlier, and maybe I should have spent a little more time on that, that given the environment we're in right now, no, we don't want to call the police. We don't want to call the police. I think about that often. You call the police because you're abused. You might end up getting arrested by the police for some other reason. But we don't, because of the fact that the police don't have the reputation for being protectors as they're supposed to be. You also don't want to see your spouse, your partner in the police system. And we know why, because bad things happen to people who encounter police. That's happening all the time. That's a reality for where we are. That's why it's important to know about the other resources that are available. And I put up at the end, taking advantage of the domestic abuse hotlines that are available locally and throughout the state as alternatives. Let's put those systems to the test, and let's do what we can. Above all, wherever we can, if we can, let's leave for our own safety.
May I chime in for a second? I want to follow up on that question, because that notion of addressing the reality that some don't want to expose their abuser to the system, this is exactly what's happening in the streets right now. Young people and others are finding the courage to say, hey, this is about white supremacy, institutionalized racism, and they're not afraid to speak out and name it. And so there's truth and power in that. And so that needs to be supported. So I agree with Dr. Taylor on that. You know, I think people now are getting over that fear. They're saying we have to call it like it is. And hopefully they will start to go down that pathway. That's something that our other moderator, Tanya Covington, likes to talk about in terms of restorative justice and how do we move that to healing. So just a comment. Thank you, Dr. Taylor, for that.
And that's a great segue to talk about restorative justice too, because that's a huge issue. And again, how our children in particular are affected by the absence of effective restorative justice programs in schools and in the community. We need to begin to think and push harder to bring those kinds of services into our communities, because we position ourselves then to address so many other issues around domestic violence and interpersonal violence if we have those kinds of programs in place. And unfortunately, we don't have them here, and we need to.
Certainly. Another good comment there from Dr. Cruz on the side. You can take that, Jim.
Let's see. Given the financial despair people of color are confronting right now, what community-based interventions should we have to reduce the risk of those feelings are not directed towards the ones we love? Well, that's what we were just talking about, making certain that alternatives are in place, alternatives to police incarceration, alternatives to the legal system being brought to bear. We know it's not healthy for us right now. So again, this is a commercial for restorative justice, Tanya.
Yes.
And God knows we need it. We need it wherever we can. You know, and certainly other kinds of interventions need to be made more widely available. Psychological interventions are so effective if you can begin to bring in our behavioral health services and sit down with people and begin to discuss the psychological impact. Where did all this come from? And Dr. Martin raised that issue earlier, and we were talking about the history of structural racism. Where did it come from? What kinds of effects has it had on us? And what can we do about it? And behavioral health and restorative justice programs are two big ones that I'm a big advocate for.
And we're hoping that other people will become advocates for it so that we can make it a reality in this community. Almost anything can be dealt with if we sit down and talk about it in a rational way. And we need to begin to teach our children how to do that so that they have better ways of dealing with crisis and conflict. That's certainly something that we should be doing, and lots of us are advocates for that and trying to make it happen. So, and we had another comment, a couple about declaring racism as a public health crisis. It certainly is important, but I think what we really need to be very careful that we're not doing anything where we are victimizing the victims. The real crisis is white supremacy. And that's what we need to be working on undoing. Racism is sort of the symptom, and white supremacy is the disease.
Absolutely.
We need to be attacking the disease.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And Dr. McIver has written in. Thank you, Stephanie. She supports my philosophy about couples therapy, first of all. Also, it presumes that abuse is a relationship dynamic problem when it is in fact an individual problem, often displayed across any and all relationships. And you're so right. Thank you so much for that. Are there any more comments or questions?
It's nice to see that so many people are interested in this topic, and we've had some really good comments here. This is one of the things, talking about this and getting this out in the open is one of the things that's going to help us build a stronger community. And because we always have to realize, even though a lot of things are being done to us, we're a very resilient group of people. And we have to learn to take care of ourselves, even in the midst of all this.
That's right. That's right. So what other people are doing to us, but we also need to spend some time talking about what we do to ourselves and to one another. And that's where the work has to start for us. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Primary prevention.
Yes, absolutely. Well, thank you all for, thank you, Mr. Harvey, for this wonderful talk. And we hope that everyone is continuing to enjoy these. Please, please, if you've gotten something good out of this and appreciated it, please let the Office of African American Affairs know that. And do check out their new website. They're really attempting to have an awful lot of information that's going to help the community. So please let them know that you appreciate and enjoy that. Next Monday, our topic is going to be on education, talking about the education of children during COVID-19 and what kinds of things we need to do to make sure that our kids don't fall behind, and things that they need to know about getting ready for college, because there's an awful lot of information out there that's good that doesn't always get passed on to Black parents. So we're going to make sure that that information gets out. Okay.